For some time, I assumed I was merely ill-informed or overcautious. I've now realized that we have all been subject to a form of gaslighting, whether it's Beck's afforestation, direct air capture, carbon absorbing unicorns. The assumption is that net zero will work because it has to work. But beyond fine words and glossy brochures, there is nothing there. The emperor has no clothes.
But sort of where our public discourse is in general. You don't see a whole lot of denialism. You don't see Republicans in general calling climate change a hoax. We have an outgoing president who has declared climate change as a hoax, but that's not really even where Republicans are in general anymore. They've sort of moved on because it's just so obvious. You can't deny for the most part, for most people, what's plainly in front of them. So instead, it's sort of the thesis of the book that they've turned to a vast array of other tactics in their effort to prevent us from moving on. And that has to do with doom, despair mongering, convincing us it's too late to do anything. So why do anything?
So let's just all die since it's too late to do anything.
Right.
It's such a really weird point of view. Sorry. Why not? I'm not going to try to save myself. I'm taking off my life jacket. I just want to drown. What are you talking? No, you don't. It's just as you're saying, it's silly.
It's bizarre. And yet, you see movements like you've come across this, I know, a deep adaptation. This is a term that has become sort of prevalent in the climate discourse, a movement really, a fringe movement, but it's attracted a lot of people. And the idea is that we should just essentially, it's sort of like doomsday preppers. It's too late. Unstoppable climate change is upon us. There's nothing we can do. We'll all be extinct in 10 years. This is literally the claim by some pretty prominent players in that movement.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This is episode 2 of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in Science Communicators in 2021. It's just kind of a personal project that I've got taken on here in the spring of 2021, and this is episode 2. If you haven't seen episode 1, the link for it will be in the show notes. I'd recommend checking that out also, and there'll be 4 or 5 more coming after this, and some extra episodes suggested in all the show notes as well. This one's Bill Nye, the science guy, interviewing Michael Mann, and just give you a preview of coming attractions. My positioning of Michael Mann on this spectrum is on the bad end of the spectrum of good, bad, and ugly. Michael Mann.
Hi there. I'm Dean Walker, host of the Poetry of Predicament podcast here on YouTube. And this is the second session of what will probably be 4 or 5 sessions of my particular focus in this spring of 2021 on the good, the bad, and the ugly of science communication in our world, particularly in the USA. It's a real mixed bag, and for some reason, I know why I got on this particular track. It's the first episode, which I released a couple of weeks ago. I'm recording this one on May 19th, and I think it was around the 5th of May, approximately, that I put out the first episode, which was really some of the good news, the good, the bad, and the ugly. That was one of the best, one of the really good examples of climate, particularly climate science communicators, and that you can look up. I'll, of course, have many of the links here that I talk about in between the clips that I'm going to show you today. And I'll, of course, put the link to session 1, which was a focus on an article put out by climate scientists Wolfgang Knorr and James Dyke and John Watson. And that's really worth seeing. If in case you're needing some encouragement that there's some integrity and some boldness and some humility, and it's really just some inspiring straight communication from climate scientists about very awkward for them topics. I'd recommend highly click on that link before you even watch this one, because this one's going to be a lot less inspiring. It just has to be, the contrast has to be spoken as far as I'm concerned. This one is primarily about Michael Mann and his partner in crime, if you will. I'm saying that in a silly way. In being interviewed with Bill Nye, the science guy. So just about everybody's at least seen or heard of him at some point. He plays a lesser part in this, and this is mostly a chance for Michael Mann to speak about his new book, sell some books. That's what he's doing. And so I'm just going to go right into why I am calling Michael Mann on the bad end of the spectrum. If this is a 3-part spectrum of good, bad, and ugly. I'm about to show you the first clip of a few in this particular session. And in this one, I've rarely seen somebody dance around a point and take firmly one position and then move almost immediately to an extraordinarily different and aggressively different talking point, and then yet again shift to another aggressively different talking point. So let me tell you a little bit about these talking points. So they've recorded this just a few days after the attack on the Capitol that happened here in 2021. I believe it was January 6th. And so they mention it quite a bit. And in this, you'll hear how Michael Mann has been framing the political discourse, or lack of civil discourse, to be sure, but the strong emotions and strong political polarization that's going on in this country. And it's so interesting to hear him assert at one point that, well, the Republicans are no longer denying climate change. Sure, Trump did, but most Republicans are not anymore because it's just so darn obvious. He goes on later to assert that if the Democrats, who have a razor thin margin in the Congress right now and for the next couple of years, that they should look forward to some number of Republicans coming over because and supporting the transformation of various policies with regard to climate change. Well, because climate is such an obvious issue now, and being a denier is just no longer cool or something that the Republicans are doing. And I think you and I both know that there's just a seamless wall of no for anything that the Democrats want to do from the Republicans for the next couple of years. And that's what is going to happen. So there's just a level of absurdity just at this level, this first clip. But that's really not even the point of this particular part of the series, this episode. The reason why I'm putting this particular episode together is quite pointedly that he has created a new adversary to replace the other adversary that he says is rapidly disappearing. The deniers are no longer really as present as they were. They're being replaced by the inactivists, those that really all they care about is having people do nothing. having the American public do nothing and vote in nothing. So that I agree on. I'm seeing that robustly in place, and that's been part of the playbook all along, to be able to basically dissolve climate change as an issue in the United States. And it's been done extremely artfully, um, cynically and artfully. So you just saw a brief clip of that clip at the very beginning of this episode. And so you're going to watch him do-si-do between very conflicted talking points that just I'm having a hard time making sense of. It seems to have no connection to the reality. In fact, he tries to have it somehow make sense in light of what happened in the Capitol on January 6th. And it's crazy. So I'll let you make your own decisions on that. He then goes right into, so if their deniers are no longer the prominent force in the conservative side of politics, what are the tactics that they're now using, and what are the ones that he focuses on in his brand new book? And his main focus there is that it's the doomers that are now the most destructive voice in this entire conversation. It's quite extraordinary. And right at the center of that part of his argument is this community that I've been a part of since its inception a couple of years ago, called deep adaptation. Some of you viewers may well be active with the deep adaptation community in some way, but many have heard of it at least. And what I can tell you is that deep adaptation is at its core a stand from the man who put it together, called Jem Mendel, an academic from the UK. Basically, his aha moment was that his field, which is sustainability leadership in corporations and agencies around the world, he saw that there is no sustainability anywhere, and particularly in the dimension that in which his studies occur. And I consider that an act of power when somebody is really calls out the emperor having no clothes. That was the moment for Jem Bendel. And his assertion is that we are in collapse now to some degree, depending on where you live on the planet. And there's much more to come. And he doesn't particularly name timelines, but he's predicting soon. And as am I, as you well know if you watch the Poetry of Predicament. So what I'm inviting you to do, whether you're familiar with deep adaptation or you're not, and it's new to you, I was just ask you to make your own conclusions as you watch how Michael Mann and Bill Nye characterize this deep adaptation community at the center of this doomerism that the right wing or the conservative politics in the USA, that they're now using as their central tool to keep people inactive with regard to all these, well, primarily climate change related issues. So this will be the first of a few segments that we'll take a look at out of the interview with Bill Nye and Michael Mann, talking about his most recent book.
The world is not flat, and the world's climate is changing because of humans.
And wearing masks.
Do you really think that we're past deniers?
Well, we're still facing some fundamental challenges. I like to think we saw sort of the battle of the bulge, that the sort of last gasp of pure denialism. We were talking about this before. It almost feels like we were relitigating the Civil War over the last week here in this country. Have we really not moved that far? Are we really at that point where even the Enlightenment now seems at threat, where fundamental science is rejected simply because its implications might be inconvenient, whether it's the science of climate change or the science behind the need for social distancing and mask wearing when it comes to coronavirus. And so there is this vestige, but when it comes to sort of our larger public discourse on climate, when you look at where the larger conversation is, not paying so much attention to that small fringe of people who we've seen erupt over the last week, but sort of where our public discourse is in general. You don't see a whole lot of denialism. You don't see Republicans in general calling climate change a hoax. We have an outgoing president who has declared climate change as a hoax, but that's not really even where Republicans are in general anymore. They've sort of moved on because it's just so obvious. You can't deny, for the most part, for most people, what's plainly in front of them. So instead, it's sort of the thesis of the book that they've turned to a vast array of other tactics in their effort to prevent us from moving on. And that has to do with the doom despair mongering, convincing us it's too late to do anything. So why do anything?
So let's just all die since it's too late to do anything.
Right.
It's such a really weird point of view. Sorry. Why not? I'm not going to try to save myself. I'm taking off my life jacket. I just want to drown. What are you talking? No, you don't. It's just as you're saying, it's silly.
It's bizarre. And yet, you see movements like you've come across this, I know, a deep adaptation. This is a term that has become sort of prevalent in the climate discourse, a movement really, a fringe movement, but it's attracted a lot of people. And the idea is that we should just sort of, essentially, it's sort of like doomsday preppers. It's too late. Unstoppable climate change is upon us. There's nothing we can do. We'll all be extinct in 10 years. This is literally the claim by some pretty prominent players in that movement. So we should all just, move out to the country and live our lives off the grid, our remaining few years, and enjoy ourselves because it's all going to be gone. And, that message is more disabling, has done more damage, in my view, than even many of the claims of the climate change deniers. And look, the inactivists, the forces of inaction, they don't care about the path you take to inaction. They just care about the destination. Whether the path is denialism of the science or denialism of the possibility of doing anything about it, it's still disabling.
Okay, so this next clip, couple in a row, some staggering ignorance, in my judgment, coming up from both Bill Nye first and then Michael Mann. The first one is Bill Nye waxing poetic about how quickly the marriage equality issue has been handled in the past decade or so. That it was just mind-boggling for him how quickly it all happened. So that's what's happening now with climate change, right? So again, this is something that just is like fingernails on a chalkboard to me that seems to invalidate the decades of struggle for marriage equality and so many other equity issues across gender, across race, and so on. But he's trying to make a point of when something happens, it happens fast, right? From his white male privileged point of view, boy, it just happened so quickly. I just turned around and it was all of a sudden time for marriage equality. So let's just take a look at that, and then we'll do the next one with Michael Mann.
The thing that I take heart is, I'm not changing the subject. I just think about same-sex marriage. People were against same-sex marriage. They're just raving, literally willing to kill each other over it because it was equivalent. It was as bad as anything, and it was against some religious precepts and so on. But the last 20 years, the last 10 years, everybody went, well, oh, okay, I guess those same-sex people pay taxes. I guess that's okay. It's like, if you don't believe in same-sex marriage, don't marry somebody of your sex. You can manage this. Anyway, I just think that's just how quickly it all changed.
Absolutely. You know, I'm
Makes
so
me
glad.
think about climate change.
No, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Bill. And this is a theme of the. You might not have gotten to that chapter yet, but it's exactly this point that you're making. You know, the tipping points. There are tipping points of the bad kind. You know, we don't want to see the collapse of the ice sheets and the sea level rise that goes with that. So there are tipping points in the climate system we rightfully fear, but there are good tipping points in public consciousness, and we saw that on marriage equality some years ago. I would argue we're going through one of those moments right now on issues of racial justice, and I think that the events of the last week truly crystallized that when we saw the differential justice and how those domestic terrorists were treated versus peaceful Black Lives
They're
Matter.
carrying Confederate flags. I mean, it's
people
just
with their flags.
incredible. It's right at what I can believe. It's right at the limit.
They were
I'm
beating
so old,
cops
people.
with the flags and the pipes that they were carrying. Law and order.
Sledgehammer.
Okay, this next segment is when they start to assign the youth of America and the world the job of really taking on and changing this world, and they're the ones that are going to do it, and certainly not us old people. And they both have strong feelings about what's going to motivate them, or what they're demanding, and so on. And just a recap on the deep adaptation part. So at the center of the deep adaptation community and the work that they're doing and what they stand for is to be able to first tell the truth about what we are each experiencing, for the collapse aware community to be able to come together safely without argument, and to be able to really share the awkward, the uncomfortable emotions that can occur when we start to tell the truth about what we're actually doing on the planet now, and which of the earth and human systems have actually begun to collapse, or have been in collapse for some time now, because of human impact. So, we have this organization, this loosely knit organization that is community, if you will, that is committed to finding loving alternatives to the often fearful or angry or blaming and shaming and so on reactions that can happen when someone is confronting this level of collapse. So that's the new villain, just to remember, that is at the center of Michael Mann's newest book. Michael Mann and Bill Nye are both extraordinarily well-known science communicators, very influential characters in mainstream media. And I just find it extraordinarily disturbing that they have chosen deep adaptation to be the villain, if you will, the focal point of who is really doing the most damage to the trust of the youth. For instance, in the next point that they're going to be talking about, what on earth could be causing a lack of trust in the youth toward the older generations? Oh, well, it must have something to do with this new fangled group called Deep Adaptation, who are calling for a full feeling of these awkward or difficult or uncomfortable emotions, as we come to face full frontal the elements of collapse that are present in our world right now. So that was just a brief recap of what my head is spinning with, trying to understand what Michael Mann is saying in his new book and what Bill Nye is trying to get at, and particularly in this next segment when they're talking about what the young people of the world are up to, or what they should be up to, and so on. Again, I'll let you just make your own conclusions.
Young people aren't gonna put up with this.
They're not putting up.
Going to put up with old people changing the climate.
Yeah. They're holding us accountable, and that's one of the reasons the final chapter of the book accurately reflects my true cautious optimism that we're going to do this. And it comes from, the efforts by folks like you, Bill, to really bring the public on board.
And you, Mike, it's your book we're selling today.
We're all doing our part. We're all doing our part, but it's the kids, right? The infectiousness of the youth climate movement and the way that they've sort of recentered this conversation where it always should have been about ethics. This isn't just about science and politics and policy. It's about ethics, intergenerational ethics. What sort of world do we want to leave behind? And I think they've recentered that conversation where it needed to be. We have this favorable shift in the political winds, where there's now a mandate, a president who not only supports climate action, he campaigned on it. So Biden really has a mandate, and we've seen just in the planning stages of the administration, they've telegraphed that they really see this as a major part of their mission. So a lot of good things coming together, a lot of challenges that remain. And that's what the book, I'm finally answering, by the way, the question you asked me 15 minutes ago. Book. It was because I think we're so close now. And yet there are these obstacles that have been thrown in our way by the inactivists, the forces of inaction, and they're insidious. They're harder to recognize. They're more subtle than outright denial of the science, but they're every bit as pernicious.
So let me ask you this, though, along the line. Is it a balance? Is it poker chips on, let's pick something else, quarters on one side and quarters on the other? Like, are you saying that the people who are going to do something about climate change now outweigh people who are trying to keep us from doing something about climate change?
Yeah, well, the old saying, it's rumored to have been, I don't know if it was one of the early 19th or early 20th century physicists. I don't know if it's Niels Bohr or Schrodinger, or science advances one funeral at a time.
So I always think about Fred Singer. Everybody, this guy died this year. This major contrarian.
We're not laughing at that, but the fact is that it is true that thinking sometimes changes fundamentally on a generational time scale, and what we're seeing is the kids taking over. Right, they're not yet in a position of authority. They can't implement policy. Most of them can't vote, but they can certainly influence public opinion, and that's what they're doing. So I do think it's a tipping point moment. I think it's like marriage equality. I think we're nearly there on climate. We're going through that on racial justice right now. I believe we are in a tipping point moment, and I think the next one up is climate.
So about this next section, try and remember best you can who he is ascribing the greatest damage to in these days, and that is the deep adaptation and doomer people in the world. And he is now going into quite a in-depth piece about the complicity, the downright accountability of ExxonMobil and other oil majors for the past 40 to 50 years, creating ongoing campaigns of disinformation and manipulation of public consciousness, not to mention just the media narrative. And, I keep looping back to what he's saying about who's really doing the most damage these days, and especially to the trust of the young people, and why the young people won't take it anymore, and they'll stand up and take the mantle right away from those old people as soon as they die in 10 or 20 years and so on. When I look at the amount of gaslighting and then outright distortion, disinformation, lying, and control of the national and international narrative for decades, is it any wonder that there's a lack of trust from virtually any age group who's even slightly aware of what's been going on, but especially the young people who have grown up knowing only this, knowing only that we've known for 40 plus years. And during those 40 years, we've seen only an increase in every conceivable impact measure of human impact, including, and of course, probably predominantly the climate change measures. Um, wouldn't that have an extraordinary effect on the trust of the young people growing up into that environment of lying? One would think. So let's hear Michael Mann talk about ExxonMobil and others and their disinformation campaign of the past number of decades.
You know what, Bill? And I tell this story, as you know, early in the book. ExxonMobil, in their own internal documents, not anything that they were sharing with the public, but in their internal memos, there was a statement by their own scientists that were looking. They made climate projections, by the way, that put us all to shame. ExxonMobil in the early 1980s predicted exactly where we would be today with the CO2 level in the atmosphere and the warming that we would see.
How did they do that? How did they do that?
Well, so they knew, there was enough of a consensus on sort of the climate sensitivity, how much warming CO2 causes. But what was amazing is that they could predict the CO2 level. In other words, they were able to predict the success of their disinformation campaign to prevent us from acting.
Okay, we're burning right through this thing. Just a couple more. So in this next clip, Bill Nye asks Michael Mann, what's the problem? What's the negative aspect of Green New Deal in the political environment today? So he's going to address that. And basically it comes down to there's too much in it. It's too broad. It's never going to get voted in with such a thin margin. So yeah, probably true. And I don't know that I could argue that. But again, the built-in argument for how odd Michael Mann's communication has been with this kind of ping pong talking points through this whole assessment of this interview. Anyway, so he talks about how the Green New Deal is too broad, will never get voted in this narrow margin political environment. So for at least a couple of years, if not longer. So cut it way down to just the bare essentials and use every other political vehicle that's possible, executive orders and so on. He does also mention that one of the big problems with the Green New Deal is it's not mentioned anywhere in it to install a carbon pricing program here in the States, which has obviously been contentious and an idea on both sides of the aisle time and again, because carbon pricing is indeed one aspect of what's called net zero. So again, bringing your attention back to that session 1 in this good, bad, and ugly series about climate communicators, science communicators in 2021. So go back and really hear that, listen to that, get the scoop on this whole idea of net zero as a possibility, as not just a possibility, but as an integral part of every mitigation strategy and every political strategy that's available today, for sure in the USA and in most industrialized countries right now. So basically that first session of this series, making it a very strong point that basically net zero is bunk, is propaganda, and will not work, is not working, hasn't worked, and will not work. So there's a couple of the pieces that are coming at you. Just want to give you a chance to hear from Michael Mann's mouth how he has put together this book, which is supposed to be such a prescription for effective action in these times. And I think this puts kind of an appropriate ribbon on the not only the confusing nature of what he's trying to say, but also basically the fallacies that are underpinning, that are in the foundation of everything he's saying in his book and in this interview. So let's do this one piece about the Green New Deal, new political strategies, and so on, and we'll take it from there.
They were thinking about this. And so let me ask you this then. One of the knocks, like this is all very reasonable. Hardcore libertarians, okay, we'll have a free market, we'll have a price on carbon. Where the money goes, we'll have to take a meeting about that. But let's say we have that. What's wrong, or what's the knock on the Green New Deal?
So, I think where it runs into trouble is that it's just so broad. There's a worthy but very large sort of social programs agenda, jobs for everyone, healthcare. These are all laudable goals. But as you know, in sort of our divided political atmosphere, something like that is anathema to enough conservatives that it's really difficult to see it pass a 50-50 Senate. Now, if we had look, what I would have liked to have seen is a blue wave that would produce large enough majorities in both houses of Congress that we could pass something expansive like that, like a Green New Deal. But we've got to work with what we have over the next 2 years. We have no time to lose. And that means advancing some sort of climate legislation, what we can get through. And there's some reason to believe that there is some support on the Republican side of the aisle for some of these programs. Look, $35 billion, as you know, of green energy stimulus in that stimulus bill that passed both houses of Congress overwhelmingly. So I was surprised that passed so easily, that got into there. That suggests, there's a foot in the door here now.
Do you think the Green New Deal reaches too far? Is there a way that you would calibrate how far the Green New Deal does reach to engage as many people as possible?
Yeah, I think right now, given the sort of the still divided political atmosphere in Washington, D.C., we're going to need more narrowly focused legislation. It can't cover as much ground as the Green New Deal, even though all of those goals that we talked about are laudable.
It's only 7 pages, but man, it's far-reaching. Yeah.
It is very far-reaching. And one thing that was disappointing to me, most of the versions that we're talking about of the Green New Deal don't include carbon pricing, which is one of the critical tools in the toolbox. And we need all of the tools in the toolbox, and that tool is missing. It's like your monkey wrench is missing.
So once again, in the next year or two, do you have advice for us? Writing to congressmen? What should we be doing?
Yeah, so we've taken the first step. We turned out and voted. You get the government you vote for, and there were enough of us who cared enough about science and reason and fact-based discourse and climate change that we prevailed in this election. That's a good thing.
By that much.
by that much, exactly. And what that means is that we can't stop here. We're going to have a very closely divided Senate. It's going to be a huge fight over all of these things that we're talking about. We need to be out there providing cover, air cover for the politicians who are willing to do the right thing and argue for doing the right thing. We need to be providing support. We need to be talking about this issue. We need to be communicating it. We have to use the one thing that all of us have, a voice, to make sure that this is part of the conversation going forward. Look, we've got this huge distraction right now playing out because of that very unfortunate incident last week at the Capitol, and we need to deal with that and the immediate consequences of it. We have to have some larger conversations about all of the issues wrapped up in that, including issues of racial justice and equality and just decency, human decency, and the meaning of our Constitution, which you read from. But we can't lose sight of the fact that, well, it's going to be tough. We've got that challenge in front of us immediately, and yet we've got to be making real progress on the pandemic, on the climate crisis, and there's no opportunity for resting here. All of us have to be out pushing for these policies, demanding accountability on the part of our politicians, even the ones who we think are our friends, are in the party that we support, won't always do the right thing if there isn't enough pressure. Because look, there's a lot of pressure coming from ExxonMobil. There's a lot of pressure coming from the fossil fuel industry. We've got to be putting in, to bring it back to physics, an equal and opposite, in fact, greater amount of pressure to move the object in the right direction.
All right. We're down to the last couple of sections here, just a very few minutes left to go. That last commentary from Michael Mann, the equal and opposite, no, in fact, greater pressure that we're supposed to somehow at the grassroots level provide for the politicians in our world to stand up and take notice to us at an equivalent or greater level than they do to the huge corporations that provide the vast majority of the funding for their office. Yeah, okay. So again, I'm just kind of head exploding. I feel very condescended to, like, if with enough letters to the editor, with enough writing to our Congress people. I'm going to give you one last little segment where they both have some very simplistic, very, in my view, condescending and simplistic solutions or actions that we can do in these times. So again, I'll leave it to your conclusions, you know mine, and so we're just about on the last clip, and I'll see you just on the other side.
Anyway, we can do this, everybody. Let's be optimistic. Let's get out there and do all of these things. Write to your congressman, tell them that you think climate change is important. Encourage them, I guess, to buy cartons and read it.
Letters to the editor of your local paper. You know, involve yourself in civic organizations. Become involved in some environmental organizations. They need our help
I believe the social justice aspect of all this will happen naturally. I don't mean to ignore it or set it aside, but I think Black Lives Matter, social justice warriors, and they go by various names, and climate people will all be working together. So a question I always have I have a lot of relatives that live in rural areas and in Virginia and I guess adjacent to rural areas in Missouri, Kansas and Missouri. What is it about cities that makes people turn blue on the election map? What is it? What's wrong with those people in cities that they vote for progressive causes or progressive candidates?
The chicken and egg problem, isn't it? You know, is it the people who move to cities or people who want that environment, want to interact with a diverse array of other people? Urban lifestyle appeals in general to people with progressive values. But I think it works in both directions. But being around diverse communities of people brings you along. And I've seen that as a college instructor. I'll tell you, I love these kids from Pennsylvania. They're great kids, but some of them come here with especially from some of the rural areas, with pretty narrow life experiences and very little experience interacting with a diverse, multicultural sort of groups of people. And it's so wonderful to watch that evolution happen. During the first year, I get them during their first semester. I teach a first-year seminar course, and I get to know them because I limit it to 20 students. And you watch over the course of that first semester, you watch some of these kids really growing and just turning into far more complete human beings. And it's a wonderful thing to watch, and it's one of the things that gives me hope, right? Watching the impact that we can have. We can change our lifestyles. Look how dramatically we have changed our lifestyles over the last few months. And that's temporary. And it's not going to solve the climate problem because it is temporary. To solve the climate problem, we really need to decarbonize our civilization. And we're starting to do that, but it's not like we really did that over the last year. But we're moving in the right direction. We're turning the corner. There is still time. The doom and gloom is not supported by the science. There is still time to avert the worst impacts of climate change. The only thing that can stop that is our fear that it's too late and our inability to demand accountability of our policymakers to act on our behalf rather than on the behalf of the polluting interests who for too long been able to control our politics on this issue. So just we can do it. Bill, as Bill likes to say, I'm going to co-opt Bill's tagline, and I'm going to change this, like, change the world. Let's change the world, but even more, we can change it for the better. We can all.
All right, you made it through this particular episode in the series, The Good, Bad, and Ugly of Science Communicators in 2021. And again, this was the episode 2, which is focusing on an interview with Michael Mann and Bill Nye, the science guy. So I hope this was useful for you. It's particularly important for all the reasons, for me, it's important for all the reasons I've made clear in this particular episode. One last comment about the last segment we just got through watching. I'm really consider myself a recovering doomer, meaning that I really am not interested in trying to convince anybody of anything, and which was sort of my early history in that, as it is for so many of us. And now really I just speak to the choir. I speak to people who are, for some reason or another, they're clear that they're experiencing some amount of human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems from their perspective on some scale in their life. It could be quite local, depending on where they live. It could be political. It could be on a national, a state, a regional, or a global scale. Different people have different ways of perceiving that and framing their experience of collapse that's either happening now or soon to come. And to the person that I speak to in that, there's this sobriety that shows up in them. And this is even true for quite young children who understand what's going on. There's this understanding that the powers that be are in place, and they're in place for a reason. They're immensely powerful. They've controlled the democratic process in the USA and elsewhere for decades, for perhaps hundreds and even longer numbers of years. And so I think it's just immensely naive and condescending and even gaslighting for Michael Mann to be saying, well, gee, all we really need to do is write letters to the editor and speak to one another, and perhaps we could contact our congressperson and put some pressure on them. Those particular ideas, well, they're something, and they're better than nothing. And I'd be the last to discourage anybody from any sort of action in these existential issues. There's no irrelevant action. It's if it's important to you and it's within your reach, please do it. But what I'm talking about is the scale at large, which is all those efforts are going to get eaten for breakfast. They're just inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. So again, I believe that you're going to see some other voice. You're going to hear some other voices in these series and the other episodes that have an extraordinary ability to articulate what the issues are from a far more, again, from my point of view, sober and clear point of view. And they also have some different ideas about how to be in action in a good way. So just kind of put on your seatbelts for those particular episodes. And this one, again, I'm just deeply disappointed, and it's heartbreaking actually that these two very privileged white males just seem to have so little clue, so to be so out of touch with what the real issues are and what really engaged action at this time is at any with any kind of real framing, with any real sobriety as you look at the situation. So thank you for sitting through this particular episode. Hope you have at least got it on your schedule to go back and see episode 1 if you haven't already. The link for that will be in the show notes, as will, it's important to mention, there's kind of a hidden episode that I'll mention each time for those of you who are interested enough to do a little deep dive. There are a chain of earlier episodes that I did in the name of, I believe is in 2019, uh, was an author named Jonathan Franzen, who wrote his particular point of view about how to engage by finding what really matters most to us in our own hearts individually, and then just taking that love of that aspect of being alive and just going for it. Just stand for that, go for that, be active with that. And what's really strange is that he drew the wrath of a number of social justice voices and other science communicators, including one named Kate Marvel, who titled her article in Scientific American, "Shut Up, Franzen," which astoundingly brash for her and for Scientific American, both of which usually has a certain amount of decorum. Um, Again, for those of you who are interested in this topic, I would recommend, if you haven't seen those, check them out. They're really worth checking out. Uh, just how deeply self-sabotaging and self um, discouraging we can be as what could possibly be an aligned body of human beings standing up and saying, we must be in action together. We must realize and nurture and reclaim the commons on this planet together. And how far we are from that. Obviously, massive events in 2020 took us even further apart for some portions of the population, closer for others. So there are some number of episodes coming. Please stay posted. Again, if this is your cup of tea, do the deep dives if that sounds good to you. And thanks so much for watching the Poetry of Predicament.